Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
You're tuned in to Cineversary, a podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Each month, we send happy birthday wishes to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. That's everything from a 20th all the way to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that now meets weekly on Zoom. Well, it's October, the month of Halloween, and a great time to celebrate all things spooky and sinister, including horror movies. Sorry, got a little carried away there. In this installment of your favorite podcast, we're going to honor what many consider to be the finest of all fright films ever made. In fact, in Rotten Tomatoes' recent updated ranking of the top 200 best horror movies of all time, this picture came in number one, and for good reason. It's Alfred Hitchcock's ultimate treatise on terror, Psycho, originally released in 1960 and celebrating a 60th birthday this year. And I've lined up the perfect guest for this month's foray into fear, Alexandre Philippe, the Swiss filmmaker known for his in-depth documentaries on fan-favorite genre films, including Memory, The Origins of Alien, the forthcoming Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist, and especially 7852, which deconstructs the infamous shower scene from Psycho. Alexander and I will check into the Bates Motel to examine why Psycho is worth celebrating all these years later, its impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it's stood the test of time, and more. Before we carve up our spotlight film for October, however, let's get some crucial context on Psycho, courtesy of the fine folks at Wikipedia. So Psycho is a 1960 American psychological horror thriller film produced and directed by Alfred Hitchcock. The screenplay, written by Joseph Stefano, was based on the 1959 novel of the same name by Robert Bloch. The film stars Anthony Perkins, Janet Leigh, Vera Miles, John Gavin, and Martin Balsam, and centers on the encounter between a female embezzler on the run and Norman Bates, the shy proprietor of a secluded old motel. Psycho was seen as a departure from Hitchcock's previous film, North by Northwest, having been filmed on a lower budget in black and white and by a television crew. The film was initially considered controversial and received mixed reviews, but audience fascination and outstanding box office returns prompted a major critical reevaluation. Psycho was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including Best Supporting Actress for Janet Leigh and Best Director for Hitchcock. Psycho today is considered one of Hitchcock's best films and praised as a major work of cinematic art by international film critics and scholars due to its slick direction, its tense atmosphere, the effective camera work, a memorable score, and iconic performances. Often ranked among the greatest movies ever, by the way, Psycho ranks number 14 on the AFI's Top 100 list, published in 2007, it set a new level of acceptability for violence, deviant behavior, and sexuality in American films, and is widely regarded as the earliest example of the slasher film genre. After Hitchcock's death in 1980, Universal Pictures began producing follow-ups. These include 3 sequels, a remake, a made-for-television spin-off, and a prequel television series. In 1992, the Library of Congress deemed Psycho culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry. Psycho garners a 96% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes, where its average critical score is 9.22 out of 10. As is custom at this time in our podcast, we turn to the movie's original trailer, but here's a heads up, folks. This first trailer for Psycho is completely different from what you might expect. In fact, it's one of the most creative and humorous trailers ever made, especially for a horror film. It's also a bit on the long side, but far be it from me to trim down what the master of suspense intended here. So, here goes.
Good afternoon. Here we have a quiet little motel. tucked away off the main highway, and as you see, perfectly harmless looking, when in fact, it has now become known as the scene of the crime. This motel also has, as an adjunct, an old house, which is, if I may say so, a little more sinister looking, less innocent than the motel itself. And in this house, the most dire, horrible events took place. I think we can go inside because the place is up for sale, although I don't know who's going to buy it now. In that window on the second floor, the single one in front, that's where the woman was first seen. Let's go inside. You see, even in daylight, this place still looks a bit sinister. Now, it was at the top of these stairs that the second murder took place. She came out of the door there and met the victim at the top. Of course, in a flash, there was the knife, and in no time, the victim tumbled and fell with a horrible crash. I think the back broke immediately. It hit the floor. It's difficult to describe the way that the twisting of the well, I won't dwell upon it. Come upstairs. Of course, the victim, or should I say victims, hadn't any conception as to the type of people they would be confronted with in this house, especially the woman. She was the weirdest and the most... Well, let's go into her bedroom. Here's the woman's room, still beautifully preserved. And the imprint of her figure on the bed where she used to lay. I think some of her clothes are still in this wardrobe. This was the son's room, but we won't go in there because his favorite spot was the little parlor behind his office in the motel. Let's go down there. This young man, you had to feel sorry for him. After all, being dominated by an almost maniacal woman was enough to drive anyone to the extreme of, well, let's go in. Well, I suppose you'd call this his hideaway. His hobby, as you see, was taxidermy. Crow here, an owl there. Now, an important scene took place in this room. There was a private supper here. And, oh, by the way, this picture has great significance because, let's go along to cabin number 1. I want to show you something there. All tidied up. The bathroom. Well, they cleaned all this up now. Big difference. You should have seen the blood. The whole place was, well, it's too horrible to describe. Dreadful. And I'll tell you, there's a very important clue was found here. Down there. Well, the murderer, you see, crept in here. Very slowly, of course, the shower was on, there was no sound. And,
Attention, boys and ghouls, like what I did there. It's my duty to notify you that we are about to transverse into spoiler territory. Alexander and I will be discussing critical plot points, twists, and fine details about Psycho that would completely ruin it for virgin eyes and ears. So consider yourself forewarned. Although if you haven't screened Psycho by now, or you don't know of its dark secrets at this point, perhaps you're already among the dead and buried. Whoops, got a little carried away there again, so my apologies. Also note that me and my guests don't delve too deeply into the shower scene itself, as that is deserving of an entire podcast episode on its own, you could argue. Instead, I highly encourage you to watch his film 7852, which scrutinizes that sequence thoroughly and satisfyingly. And now, if your nerves can stand it, let's commence. It's my pleasure to welcome filmmaker Alexandre Philippe, director of several highly acclaimed documentaries, including Memory, The Origins of Alien, Leap of Faith, William Friedkin on The Exorcist, and 7852, which dissects the shower scene in Psycho and provides a masterclass on the methods and genius of Alfred Hitchcock. Alexander, welcome to Cineversary, and thanks for saying yes.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
So when and where did you first see Psycho, and why is this movie important to you?
Well, I have a long history with Hitchcock. In fact, I was watching Hitchcock films from a very, very young age. My dad was watching them. And so it's always felt to me that, that there has never been sort of a time when Hitchcock entered my life. It feels like he was always around.
Okay.
And so it's so funny because when people ask me, well, when did you first watch Psycho? When did you first watch Vertigo or whatever? Like, I don't have that answer. I remember that I was watching those films very, very early, and watching them again and again and again. So that film, like some of his other great films, of which there are many, obviously has a huge part in my played a huge part in my life, not just as a filmmaker, but as a person. And it is. I don't think it's his greatest film. I'll just put it out there. But I think the shower scene specifically is the most significant moment in movie history.
Wow.
And I think that as far as a sort of cinematic trick, I don't think anything comes close in the history of movies to what Hitchcock was able to pull off with Psycho.
Yeah, and what a trick, right? I mean, we're going to dig into this a little bit by virtue of the fact that you obviously did a whole movie on the shower scene here, but I'm sure you're enamored of the film overall, and of course of Hitchcock's body of work. But yeah, for my part, I first watched Psycho in a Hitchcock film class in college nearly 30 years ago, and then the movie immediately opened my eyes to the infinite possibilities of cinema and the ingredients necessary for, of course, top of the line suspense, thriller / scary films. Mm-hmm. But by my second viewing, it was pretty quick. I was convinced this was the finest horror movie ever made, bar none. And I'm still convinced of that today. It remains my very favorite horror film. So it's hard to top Psycho in my book. But
I agree.
Why do you think the movie is worth celebrating all these years later, Alexander? Why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time?
Oh my goodness. I mean, we could be talking all day about the reasons to celebrate Psycho. I think it changed a lot of things, certainly in terms of the medium, in terms of, Hitchcock really pulling the envelope. Obviously, the editing was completely revolutionary. The idea of removing your protagonist halfway through in this particular fashion.
Sure.
And shocking the audience in a way that really they had not. I mean, you really have to understand that. I mean, I think it was much more than a movie. It was and I think it was in many ways much more than an event. It was a moment that, the people who walked into the theater not knowing what they were about to watch and then walked out, I think they had literally crossed a threshold and came out in a new world. In a way, right? It's like, the 50s were over. Welcome to the 60s. Welcome to,
Yeah, baptism by fire.
Well, completely, and that's the kind of stuff that, you don't really see happen in movies. I mean, these moments that are so completely, profoundly, they change culture. They become cultural events.
Isn't it amazing, though, that I mean, I'm going to presume you're even younger than I am, and that we were not alive when Psycho, perhaps,
I was not,
first
no,
came
no.
out. Okay, I was not.
Yeah.
And yet it is so intriguing to me. I wish I could go back in time and
yeah.
be in one of those theater seats opening day or opening night and just experience the sheer exhilaration and just the picking up the vibes from the crowd. It had to be unlike anything anyone had ever seen before in a movie theater. And I mean, it's easy to take these things for granted today, but back then, you're absolutely right. It must have been a sea change moment.
Oh yeah, for sure. And obviously, well, in my film, Peter Bogdanovich talks about, the experience of, he was there at the first, public screening in New York, and nobody really knew what to expect. I mean, obviously Hitchcock was very, very tight-lipped, even with the press. So nobody really knew what they were getting into. And,
right.
And, this story of, he actually told me that when Mother opens the curtain, the screams in the theater were so loud that the first time around, he didn't even hear the Bernard Herrmann score.
Amazing.
I mean, that just gives you a sense of the magnitude of the event that scene represented. It's insane. So yeah, I think I mean in my lifetime, really, I think there were two moments that changed me. There was the Empire Strikes Back, sort of, Luke, I'm your father moment. And sort of as a kid, just being completely blown away by that and not trying to be able to wrap my head around. I mean, I think that moment, that movie changed me.
Yeah, major twist.
But I think since then, it was the only moment that I experienced a sort of a collective reaction to a moment in a movie theater was the Blair Witch Project.
Yeah, that was quite a visceral experience. I can attest. I was there opening weekend, and boy, I was blown away by that one as well.
I mean, that final shot, there was, and I was in a huge theater, actually in New York City. It was about 2,000 people there. And there was this absolute sort of like shiver, collective sigh of dread.
Yes.
It was unreal,
Right.
So that's as close, I think, as I've gotten to Psycho, but probably nowhere near anyway.
Right. Ask me, and I would say this film still matters for so many reasons we don't have time to get into here. I mean, this movie has been dissected to death. And of course, we're not necessarily going to say anything that's revolutionary or never thought of before. But I mean, we're going to echo a lot of the same sentiments that have been expressed about Psycho all these decades. But fittingly so, it's 60 years. It's a 60th birthday, and it's deserving of a further dissection here. But I think it still matters because it's an exemplary work of craftsmanship by a master at the height of his powers. You think about the carefully planned visuals. I mean, really carefully planned, the storyboarding by Saul Bass, and just the level of sophistication that went into every single frame.
Yeah.
The inspired editing choices we could talk about and how it was revolutionary for the day. All-time great score, one of the absolute best by Bernard Herrmann.
Yeah.
The brave storytelling, like you said, the gutsy decision to kill off your main character 1/3 of the way through the film. The precision, time, suspense, all of these things combine to create an unforgettable experience, of course. I think it also matters because of the moral ambiguity and the uncertainty we end up feeling. I can only speak for myself, but I think others have felt this as well. There is no calming moral resolution by the end of the movie. Yes, the villain is captured, but we're left feeling unnerved by Norman's interior monologue in the final scene.
Sure.
And I also think it stood the test of time, Alexander, because despite its age and its creakiness around the edges, it is 60 years old, it is black and white. Some people aren't going to cop to that, but yet Psycho still feels modern and relevant to me. With its sudden graphic violence, the creepy voyeuristic themes, and this, the cynical worldview that suggests a random and cruel hand of fate, it still commands the power to shock, disturb, and unsettle.
Oh, 100%. And then, I think for me, one of the most gratifying things about touring with 1752, and that was a very, very extensive world tour, and getting to not just experience, sharing the film with audiences from around the world, but also getting to talk to them about Psycho. What was amazing to me is every single screening, there would be a number of people who would show up to watch 1752 who had never actually watched Psycho.
Oh, that is amazing.
And it's wild. And but also, and I remember specifically there were a couple of UK screenings, one in Cambridge, where there were so many young people, young college kids who had never watched the film, and it was so exciting to see the excitement, because oftentimes it would be a double bill, right? 1752 followed by Psycho.
Okay.
And to see their excitement at discovering that film that they had heard of for so long, really after watching it, just, coming up to me and saying how great they thought it was, so it's not like I don't think I've ever heard anybody come up to me and say, oh my gosh, that film is so dated. It was more like that film is amazing, So that's really cool.
No, absolutely. I mean, I'm so glad you're able to share these recollections. You made the movie, and it had to be an amazing experience. But yeah, like you said, just riffing off of the reception, the vibes of the people who saw your film. And then, like you said, the phenomena of some of these folks didn't even see the original Psycho. So if anything, hey, that's a good thing, though, because your film is a gateway to a whole new experience that they're going to discover. And that's pretty cool.
Yeah, and I think all of my films in a way are about, they're really sort of a bridge, I like to think, between, the quote unquote general public and film studies. Like my films have to be accessible enough for people who are not cinema studies majors to, walk out of it and say, my gosh, this was a lot of fun. This was so enjoyable. And I can go and deconstruct a film by myself because that's a fun thing to do. I really want people to understand that, you don't have to have a master's in film. You can really enjoy, studying a film by yourself and finding out the really cool details and the fun things that the filmmaker is
Absolutely.
doing.
And I applaud you I'm such a huge horror movie fan. I'm not a movie snob. Horror movies are not like The Bastard Stepchild to me anyway. And I think the fact that you've chosen to, at least in a major body of your work, to focus on, some seminal horror classics and kind of breaking them down and deconstructing them and getting experts to talk about them. I think that's an excellent approach. And it's a great way for getting, mainstream audiences to take a closer look and to see how the sausage is made, and that it's more than just disposable entertainment. So again, I really like the approach you've taken, and I can't wait to see more of your films. So keep it up.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Trust me, I am keeping it up for sure.
Awesome. So, we could talk for days on this next question, but we'll try to keep it somewhat limited. We'll hit on some of the major points if we can. But in what ways do you think Psycho was, influential on cinema and popular culture, or set trends in any way? So again, this is going to be difficult to rein it in, but I mean, in all fairness, this is one of the most influential movies ever.
Well, sure. And I think it's really important also to say that I think the negative impact of Psycho is just as important as the positive impact on Psycho. I think,
sure. Why don't you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Hitchcock went so far beyond anything that had been done before that I think filmmakers at the time sort of saw it as potentially a challenge or a carte blanche or an invitation to go, oh, well, Hitchcock went there. I'm just gonna go further. But of course, nobody went further, But I think what happened is that cinema and horror cinema suddenly became more graphic. And that's the thing that's so funny to me too, because when we obviously talk about the shower scene as being graphic, but it's not. It's very restrained. We never see the knife penetrating the skin. We never see blood. We never see any of that stuff.
And you barely see any nudity unless you're really looking closely.
Nudity, But I think because of what happens in your mind's eye, and because of obviously the way that Hitchcock tackled it, I think it opened new doors in horror cinema. And it's funny because I will say, and I'm with you, I think Psycho is probably, for my money, the greatest horror film ever made. And yet I'm not really a fan of slasher movies.
Okay.
But I'll tell you why, because I think once you've seen Psycho, it's all downhill from there for me. And and look, I'm sure there's some slasher fans who are listening to this and going, "Oh my gosh, what is he saying?" Look, that's my personal perspective. I don't enjoy watching naked women being stabbed to death in a vulnerable location.
Mm.
I don't find any pleasure in that. And again, where do you go from the elegance of Psycho? Well, you have to say, okay, well, I'm going to get more graphic. I'm going to go in color. I'm going to show some blood. I'm going to get more and more over the top in terms of the violence or whatever. And there's a point where horror cinema, I think, became, really stale, because there's only so far you can go. I'm really happy now to see the younger generation of filmmakers. And again, I'm not trying to say that, great horror films shouldn't be shocking or shouldn't be graphic, but I think it's really cool to see some of the newer generation now actually pulling back a little bit, like a film like The Witch, I think is a very exciting film, because these moments when you expect to see the greatest amount of violence and blood and horror, he pulls way back, and it's so much more chilling than what, your mind was expecting.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Also, riffing on what you're saying there in terms of, there's maybe some pros and cons to the legacy of Psycho or the influence of it. So you pointed out one potential negative is, it ratchets up the whole kind of race to a more viscera, more gore, more violence, etc. And maybe that's not everybody's cup of tea, of course. But also a good and bad point here in terms of influence or inspiration. You have to think about how he was able to get all this past the censors and how this helped. This was one of the nails in the coffin of the censorship era. Now, this was only 1960, and we didn't get the MPAA rating system until I think it was 8 years later. Yeah. But really, it took the better part of the 1960s in that decade for the barriers to fully come down. And finally, we get more adult situations. You can have, profanity, you can have nudity, for better or worse, all these things by the late 60s and early 70s. And Psycho didn't do all of this by itself, but boy, it was a major catalyst and contributor to, for better or worse, the breaking down of the censorship era.
Well, 100%. And I think, Hitchcock almost made it a point to see how far he could take it. I interviewed his granddaughter, and they still really honestly don't know in the family how he managed to not just present, because, if you read the memo that is at the Margaret Herrick Library from the censorship board, after reading the script, and basically in so many words, Hitchcock was warned that the shower scene would be problematic and it cannot be shot as is, that it would be rejected.
Right.
Not only did he go ahead and do it, but he didn't change a frame of it. The story has it that he told them, you didn't see what you thought you saw.
Right.
And at the time, it's not like you could just, use a DVD player and go frame by frame and just stop it and rewind or whatever. Right. And he must have made the case. And obviously Hitchcock was very charming and witty and all of that. He must have made the case that there is really no nudity, which is true, that there really was no real violence or blood, which is true. But it's still incredible to me that he managed to get his way. But then beyond the stabbing, when you think also about something as, it sounds almost ridiculous in our day and age, the toilet flushing, which was not allowed at the
taboo.
time.
Yep.
It was taboo. Nobody had done it before. But this was actually one of those things that Hitchcock, in fact, asked Joe Stefano to write in the script because he wanted to have that shot. And so how do you get that shot? How do you get that past the censors? Well, the only way is you have to have a major story element tied to that, which is she's getting rid of the clues and flushing, right? So that's how you get around the censors.
Clever.
It's really clever, but it's also, I think, Hitchcock enjoyed, I would imagine, enjoyed the exercise of trying to see how much he could get away with
Absolutely. That. He had to relish that opportunity with devilish delight, I'm sure.
Oh, completely,
Right. But getting back to the main point here, just in terms of influence and inspiration, we talked about breaking down the censorship barriers, especially depicting casual sex between two unmarried lovers, right?
Mm-hmm.
You actually see Janet Leigh in states of undress, depicting a peeping Tom, which, had been done in the UK a year earlier with the movie Peeping Tom, but not so much in America. So that was kind of creepy.
Yep.
The violation of a naked woman in the shower, the flushing toilet, all these things. So I just wanted to finish that point about the censorship. Getting back to this point that you first raised, which I think is crucial. It's also possibly, I can't think of any predecessor unless you can name one, but the first Hollywood movie to kill off its lead character before the midway point of the film, which essentially makes Marion a red herring like diversion and makes Psycho kind of a great practical joke played on us by Hitchcock.
I think it's very important to look at Hitchcock movies, not just by themselves, but in relationship to his other films.
Yes.
Because I do believe very strongly that Hitchcock, like Nabokov in literature, was someone who always looked at his body of work as essentially a single work. And so you cannot fully understand Psycho without understanding its relationship with the other films. Hitchcock had done it before, and he did it in 1958. He did it with Vertigo. He killed off Kim Novak halfway through the film, but he resurrected her.
You're absolutely correct, but you don't think of it in that stark contrast like you do in Psycho.
But think about what this does to an audience. In 1960, 2 years after watching Vertigo, and obviously people knew Hitchcock, they knew what to expect. They knew that he was always going to try and do something new. But when she dies in the shower and you've watched Vertigo, I think your mind goes, okay, this is a trick. She's not really dead. She's going to come back, right? No, not this time. And he sets you up for that. And that's the thing that's amazing. And so Psycho takes that step further. But again, you also have to understand there's a relationship also with Rear Window, right? When they're watching him washing the shower, clearly they're speculating that he cut her up into pieces in the bathtub, and that he's washing the shower walls now, whatever. I mean, he's already setting up these ideas, going all the way back even to the lodger, all these pristine bathrooms that you see over and over and over in Hitchcock's films, and then wham, in 1960 he actually defiles it.
Yes.
And this time Kim Novak doesn't come back. This time she's really dead. That's
a good point. And I'm glad you brought this up because it's important to compare it to earlier body of work as well as subsequent movies after Psycho. So you think about how Psycho stands in stark contrast, both visually and in terms of production values, to previous work in the 50s, especially like you mentioned, Vertigo, North by Northwest, Rear Window. Yeah. These are bigger budget, glossier color pictures with big name stars, right? As opposed to Psycho. I mean, of course, Janet Leigh is a major star, but she's only in the picture for about the first, third of the movie or so. So this was made to look like a cheap exploitation film in black and white, a longer version perhaps of one of Hitchcock's TV show episodes at the time. So it was quite different, at least in terms of approach and visuals and things like that, to his earlier stuff. And this turned out to be his last black and white movie as well. So, and kind of an anomaly for 1960, for that matter, a black and white movie this late in his career.
I mean, it's even more remarkable that it came right after North by Northwest, which is one of the most sort of lavish, fun, colorful pictures ever made with some major movie stars. And it's such a break from that. But it's also incredible to think that he was 61 years old.
That's true.
He could have stopped after North by Northwest, and we would still talk about Hitchcock today as one of the greatest filmmakers in history. So the fact that he decided to make this film that everybody told him, don't do it, it's beneath you, and that he would do it in this fashion, it is such a risk at that stage of his career. And it turned out to be his greatest financial success.
That's right. And because he put a lot of his own blood, sweat, and tears and money into it as well, as kind of an independent production that was, I guess, licensed to Paramount? Is that how it was understood? But it was, wasn't it a Shamley production? It wasn't his baby? So, I mean, you're absolutely right. This paid off. This hit the jackpot. This was really what established his fortune for the rest of his life. So never such a big success as Psycho, although, of course, he'd had a lot of successes. But even compared to Vertigo, you said, a lot of people might have been expecting, hey, Janet Leigh's going to come back. The thing is, Vertigo wasn't as well attended, and not as many people saw that. The lines were round the block for Psycho. I think this was a movie that appealed to so many more folks. And they weren't necessarily expecting that thing. But I'm glad you brought up the predecessors, the voyeurism in something like Rear Window, and even in The Lodger back in the late 20s. So he had been doing these kind of things. But still, when you think about the combination of all these elements, and the influence it had on subsequent filmmakers, it's unmistakable. I also want to bring up that Psycho manipulated audiences so devilishly, according to Hitchcock's design. But it manipulated us into, I would argue, switching allegiances and sympathies from one innocent protagonist, or semi-innocent, she did steal money, right, to another who turned out to be evil. Of course, you think of Norman Bates. You think of this great scene where Norman, he's cleaning up the mess that supposedly Mother had made in the murder, and he's waiting for that car to sink in the swamp. And the moment where you see the car stop, and Norman's kind of looking around and sweating, and we're kind of sweating with him. Yeah. You're forced to identify with this guy because he's the only major character left. I'm secretly at that moment, the first time I'm seeing Psycho, thinking, oh God, he's got to get rid of the tracks. He's got to cover up the crime. Don't miss that blood spot. Make sure the car goes down. So what does that tell you? It tells you that Hitchcock is a master manipulator.
Oh, I mean, for sure. But also, Hitchcock is able to play with different kinds of suspense, not just vicarious suspense, but in the case of the car, what we would call shared suspense. He forces us in a situation where, obviously we don't identify with Norman. We certainly don't, I would hope, don't want to identify with Norman.
Right.
But at the same time, he has done such an amazing job of developing him as a, really pathetic, sad, and empathetic figure in some ways, that when you're in that situation and you're watching the film and you have been deprived of your main character, you're holding on to this one person that you have. I mean, he's the only person you've got left at this point. Your allegiances are naturally shifting towards him, and thus you have to feel the discomfort. Yes. And that discomfort that you feel during the second part of the film is exactly what Hitchcock wants us to feel. So we become very active watchers,
yes,
by virtue of the fact that our allegiances are being challenged all the time, and we don't necessarily like where he's taking us, but we have no choice except walking out of the movie theater, which of course nobody wants to do.
We are a captive audience and we are in his hands. And that's what I mean by the manipulation. You may not feel comfortable about this, but you're kind of have a rooting interest for Norman at some points before, of course, you discover the truth.
Quite possibly the greatest scene in Psycho as a character scene is the parlor scene. The bond, the emotional bond, the text and the subtext in that scene when she's having the sandwich and they're really sharing who they are. And they're sharing very sort of personal details about them and also hiding details. There's a lot of incredible things that are left unsaid, but you walk out of that parlor scene and you can't help but feel really sad for Norman. It's not just that there's something off with this guy. Sure there is. I mean, there's something creepy. Sure there is. But man, he's just a, very sad figure.
Yeah, he's kind of pathetic.
And you sort of want to give him a hug, which is kind of weird.
Although if you're a woman watching that, you get creeped out. You see how he leans in and he's kind of staring at her and talking about that.
Yeah, at that moment you want us to, and she does, right? I mean, that's really the moment when she stands up. I think at that moment, she sees the path that he's taken, and she sees that by doing what she's done, she could, keep going down the wrong path. And instead she says, I'm going to go back to Phoenix.
Yeah, it's so interesting because one of your experts in your film notes that this could be the very moment where Norman decides to kill her, but it could also be the epiphany moment where she decides, okay, I'm going to undo what I did and I'm going to go back.
Totally.
So it's so interesting that very moment where he kind of, confronts her in this dark way could be a catalyst for both of them. So you're absolutely right. That parlor scene is perfecto. It is probably the best bit of dialogue exchange in the film.
Oh, yeah.
And just the framing, the lighting, the editing choices, the score, the brooding score. Oh, we haven't even talked about at length Bernard Herrmann's score, which is one of the all-time greats. It combines for an exceptional experience there. So what's the moral of the story of Psycho to you? What themes or messages are explored that you'd like to touch on?
I think the unnerving thing about Psycho is, and I will argue that the moral is that there is no moral. I think very clearly what I hear loud and clear from Hitch is there is no God, that you can be the person with the best of intentions. You can make a mistake. You can realize that you've made a mistake. You can decide that you're going to go back to Phoenix and, face the consequences and pay the price for what you've done. But even though you're doing the right thing, somebody can show up with a butcher knife and kill you in the shower, and the end.
Yeah. What does that tell you, right? I mean, the universe is arbitrary, pitiless, and indifferent.
You see that in The Birds as well. You know, that shot, literally the bird's eye view from the seagulls when the gas station is in flames, and you hear, it's like the birds are almost sort of laughing at it. I think The Birds is very much an extension of Psycho in terms of the moral universe that Hitchcock is trying to present to us. And I think that's why, those films are so unnerving to people.
Yeah, no question. I think there are some messages and themes to be gleaned here, of course, like duality, pairs, split
Oh,
personalities. When you consider there are so many parallels suggested between various sets of two different characters in the movie. As a few brief examples, you
mhm.
think of Marion and Norman and how they're compared and contrasted. You feel perhaps empathy for each early on in the film, even though both have committed crimes. We perhaps exonerate Marion because she's stealing the money for love and because she's stealing from a lecherous creep, perhaps. And it's easy to put yourself in Norman's shoes when he's trying to hide the body and the evidence, as we talked about.
Right.
You think of another pair like Norman and Sam, okay? Sam
Mhm.
had what Norman wanted, Marion, but couldn't have. He's honorable, handsome, and prepared. And Norman, by contrast, is this gangly, kind of awkward and unprepared man. Both were living a double life. Sam is sneaking around to be Marion's lover while Norman, personifies his dead mother. You think of a pair like Marion and Arbogast. Both are victims of Norman, but the viewer hasn't formed a subjective bond to Arbogast as they had with Marion.
Mhm.
You think of like Arbogast and Lila. They both investigate Marion's disappearance, but the sister makes it further than the private eye did and doesn't pay the price he did. You think about just Norman himself. The Norman we first meet is so different from Norman is revealed later. You think of the extensive use of mirrors and mirror images throughout the movie that possibly implies what? That maybe anyone is capable of having a different side to their nature or a split personality or something like that. So I'm
Mhm.
astounded. Every time I watch Psycho, I pay more and more attention to all the mirror kind of images
Oh
and mirror
yeah.
scenes. It's amazing.
Yeah.
There's that message and a message of course, there's maybe a hidden voyeur in all of us. You think about how often the characters are watched by other characters throughout the film. And Alexander, for that matter, how often we watch characters watching others,
Yeah.
which maybe it makes us complicit in this voyeuristic behavior. I think that's part of what Hitchcock is kind of
Mhm.
secretly getting at here. You think of examples like Norman peeping through the hole in the wall, and then someone in your movie said, well, the truth is that most people would probably do that.
Yeah.
Arbogast spying on Norman and his mother, the opening sequence in which, like a peeping Tom, the camera brings us right into the motel room where Marion and Sam have just finished having sex. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, and also the number of times that we, as the spectator, are being watched also
Mm,
by the characters. It is a circular glance, a circular gaze. That's very much what I went for with
mhm.
1752. I wanted to, and this is why I really wanted to sort of create the illusion that my interview subjects were essentially inside the Bates Motel, trapped, watching Psycho, and
Right.
we're watching them watching Psycho, but they're also watching us.
Yes.
I mean, that's the whole sort of conceit of, and
Hmm.
why I had to, well, we had to film at the Bates Motel. We had to build a set to create the interiors, recreate the interiors.
So
We had
cool.
to shot everything green screen and composite everything in the end. So I mean, talk about a magic trick. It tripled the budget of our film
I'll bet.
to do that. Yeah, I mean, all of that is very true. And Psycho, I think, has a level of complexity that I lose myself into, because you can never, ever, ever get to the bottom
Mm.
of it. But I think that's what makes it so great.
I totally agree. So this is a birthday celebration. Cineversary always celebrates a milestone anniversary of a major movie. Birthdays are all about giving presents, but I always assert that it's the fans, Alexander, who continue to get the gifts with these movies. So in your opinion, what is Psycho's greatest gift to viewers?
I think that for better or worse, movies wouldn't be what they are today without Psycho. And I think that the decades that we've had, the 6 decades now that we've had of movies and thrills in movies, both good and bad, we'd be living, I'm convinced of that, in a completely different world and popular culture if Psycho had not existed.
Mm,
So if we love what the movies are and stand for and what they've given us, then we have to be thankful for Psycho.
well said. I have several greatest gifts, so I'm going to pare it down to the essential ones here. But I think one of Psycho's greatest gifts to us is that ingeniously it leaves you feeling terrified, vulnerable, mistrustful, and conflicted,
Mhm.
even on a subconscious level, often for reasons that are not entirely obvious. Because you are compelled to identify with and sympathize with the person who turns out to be an evil psychopath, you are kind of forced to examine your own conscience by the end of the movie and
Mm.
ask yourself, am I capable of committing these kinds of crimes?
Yeah.
Do I have a bit of Norman Bates in me? Would I ever impulsively kill or steal? Now, the vast majority of people watching the movie would say, of course not. But again, it raises interesting moral dilemma questions in the viewer a bit, which I think is ingenious. Also, you think about how the film starts with the dateline of Phoenix, Arizona,
Mm.
Friday, December the 11th, 2:43 p.m. I mean, it's so specific. But right away, to me, this feels like a true crime tale And it suggests that this scenario could happen in any life, any random town. It could possibly happen to you. I mean, just the arbitrary, capricious nature of fate and how, even despite your good intentions like Marion's, you could just end up in a motel with a guy with a butcher knife and it's all over.
Yeah.
I think it brilliantly plants the seeds that you can't trust anybody. At different points in the movie, we fear the police. We fear maybe an attractive young woman who's been a loyal employee for 10 years. We don't fear her, but we're suspicious, I should say. We are suspicious or fear a would-be helpless old woman who turns out to be dead. And of course, we fear a seemingly harmless looking young man. So there's a lot of mistrust that's built.
Yeah.
And then you consider, of course, the unspeakable horrors and the unconventional behaviors suggested by Norman's actions and his past. Like the obvious ones are taxidermy of a dead person, digging up a corpse, transvestism, and not that there's anything necessarily wrong with that unto itself, but
Right.
it all adds up to behaviors that are unconventional. And then you think about maybe there's incest and necrophilia involved. It all adds up to a bouillabaisse of yucky stuff. And another greatest gift, the last one I wanted to mention, is the degree to which Hitchcock can deceive us and manipulate us. We've touched on this, but I love the fact that we're fooled by his misdirection the first time we see the movie. We think it's a story about the money theft, but it veers off into something completely different by random chance. And it's this sudden turn of direction and arbitrary twist of fate that shocks me, that shocks viewers, even subconsciously. And the MacGuffin, the $40,000 that she steals. We dwell on this up to the point where Norman throws it in the trunk and sinks it in the car. And this becomes Hitchcock's little joke. The money turns out to be insignificant by the end of the picture, despite all the attention we've invested in it. And in this way, that last shot of the car being dragged out of the swamp, Alexander, it's his final laugh at us. It's his way of tacking on a happy ending to the problem about the money, as it's probably found in the trunk by the authorities, but we don't need to stick around to see that. I mean, it's just so devious to me.
Well, it's devious from, as you said, from the very beginning, where
Yes.
Sort of giving us, such a precise location and time and date
Yes.
is already a trick in itself, because at the end of the day, of course your brain goes, okay, this is going to be important information. This is something that I need to remember. But no, it's completely inconsequential. And in the end,
Absolutely.
it's one of those little tricks. It's full of tricks. It is a hall of mirrors in many ways as well. And I think the use of doppelgangers, I mean, you can absolutely make the argument that, Marion and Norman are two sides of the same coin.
Interesting.
In a way, Norman is her shadow. They are doppelgangers. She sees something of herself in him, I think. I feel that very strongly, especially in the parlor scene.
Parlor scene, right.
These characters obviously are linked, by fate as well.
So I have to ask you before you go, why did you choose to devote an entire movie just to the shower scene? Now, I realize you cover the gamut of the movie and its themes, of course, but you really dissect that shower scene. So what was the impetus behind that? Well,
I mean, I think it really deserved and needed a cinematic treatment. And, my frustration is I feel like I've really just scratched the surface. It's way easier. It would have been way easier for me to make a 3-hour film than a 90-minute film about the shower scene, to be perfectly honest. But I will say, and I think I'm going to wait another couple of years, 2-3 years, but I will make another film about the shower scene.
Wow.
Yeah, no, it will be very, very different from 1752. I'm not going to give you the angle, but I'm very excited about it. And that'll be coming up in a few years.
Oh, wow. We got an early kind of tease on Cineversary. So that's awesome. Maybe we got a little scoop here, but that will be absolutely looking forward to that. So I have to ask you, what else you're currently working on that listeners should check out?
Obviously, my film Leap of Faith, it's just been announced, will be hitting Shudder on November 19th. So that's the film about William Friedkin and The Exorcist.
Fantastic.
But right now I'm working on 2 new features. One is about John Ford, Monument Valley and the Myth of the West. That one will be, we're aiming basically for fall 2021. And then I'm working on another film called Lynch Oz, and it's about the relationship, in fact, the way that the films of David Lynch are a dark mirror to The Wizard of Oz.
Oh, how cool is that? That sounds like a fascinating topic for a movie.
That'll be coming out in the spring of 2022. So I'm sort of wrestling with 2 big movies right now, and can't wait to share them with the world.
Oh, boy, you've just fired up our imaginations, at least mine anyway, because I am so enamored of your work and I cannot wait to see more. So thank you so much for digging deep here with me on Psycho. And I wish you the best of luck in your future projects, and we will continue to be watching for them. Alexander, thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you, Eric.
Yep, one of the perks of this gig is getting to geek out with cinematic scholars and, once in a while, actual film directors. That was a real treat getting to yak at length with Alexandre Philippe. Sir, my gratitude is unbound. Let's turn now to standing ovations. This is the point where I give a shout out to a website, movie, TV program, book, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. For October, my hat has to go off to Turner Classic Movies, which once again this year boasts a killer lineup of classic horror flicks. I'm talking old school scares from the 1930s through the 60s, and even into the 70s a bit. All this month, TCM has been featuring a variety of vintage thrillers, monster movies, and nightmare fare, but it's saving the best for last on October 30th and 31st. Now, on those 2 days, you can expect to catch, let me catch my breath here, Dr. X, The Most Dangerous Game, White Zombie, Island of Lost Souls, Freaks, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, all from 1932. You also have The Vampire Bat and Mystery of the Wax Museum from 1933, 1935's Mad Love, Universal's The Wolfman from 1941, 3 timeless Val Lewton pictures, including I Walked with a Zombie, The Seventh Victim, and The Body Snatcher from 1943 and 1945, 1953's The House of Wax, Them, with an exclamation point, from 1954, The Four Skulls of Jonathan Drake, circa 1959, The Haunting, the original, from 1963, Children of the Damned, from 1964, The Devil Rides Out, from 1968, and 1974's The Wicker Man. This is not a comprehensive list, of course, but these are highlights from Turner's Halloween lineup for the last 2 days in October that you definitely want to check out. There are many other macabre movies on their calendar between now and the end of the month as well. So for full details, I want you to visit tcm.com/schedule-monthly. And remember that even if you don't have cable, you can stream TCM via Sling TV, Hulu with Live TV, AT&T TV Now, or YouTube TV. Instead of cluttering up our podcast with advertisements, we've decided to ask our listeners for their support. We could use your help to offset the costs to produce Cineversary, which includes expenses like podcast hosting provider fees. If you'd like to make a monetary contribution to the Cineversary podcast in any amount, large or small, we've made it safe and simple by partnering with PayPal to collect the funds. Simply visit tinyurl.com, that's tinyurl.com/donate Cineversary, and click on the Donate button. Any major credit card is accepted, and the entire transaction is handled securely and confidentially by PayPal. Or if you're familiar with PayPal, you can simply send us a payment in any amount you want to cineversegroup@gmail.com, and that's spelled CINEVERSE group@gmail.com. We really appreciate your generosity. Also, I'd love to hear what you think of our Cineversary podcast. You can email me suggestions or comments at cineversegroup@gmail.com. And I encourage you to visit cineversegroup.com, the portal for my film discussion group that I launched in 2005, where you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions and read more about the movies we study. Well, that brings us to the conclusion of another installment of Cineversary. If you come this far with me, no doubt you're waiting to hear what I've got planned for next month, and I'm not going to disappoint you. In November, I'll have eyes for Bette Davis, the star of All About Eve, which celebrates a 70th anniversary in 2020. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, stay safe and healthy throughout this pandemic, ward off the evil spirits and werewolves, and cherish those classic movies because they're not getting older, they're getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.